Hey, how's everybody doing? So Diane had the first two sessions of this planning for a new database. It's like a three-part session. My session is going to be basically built around databases in general and metadata, and then what that looks like for you all, right? So I don't know if you guys, I don't know if anybody wants to unmute. I'm not opposed to that. Like you can feel free to ask questions during this. I kind of want it to be more of a open dialogue since this is like the third session of the two. Like, so if you have any questions for Diane too from the last two, I know I see a few familiar faces out there that attended the other ones. Yeah, I guess let's just get started. So basically, I work a lot in databases. It's kind of what I enjoy doing. I don't know if any of you have training in cataloging or databases, but if you don't, and if you're using CollectiveAccess, you actually do have training in it. So congrats, you are using a database. And it's a relational database versus like something like Excel, which is a flat file, which can be made into a relational database. That's the whole idea, right? So Excel is kind of what I do most of my work in. I've worked in Access, which is another form of relational database. Diane left off last week talking about metadata. So we're going to talk a little bit about metadata, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with metadata. Is anyone out there familiar? Anybody want to raise your hand if you are? No? No? Okay. Metadata is basically just data about data. So, oh, I got a hand raised. That's great. So that's what it translates to. It's been around forever. I mean, it's been around since as long as libraries have been around. Whether it was recorded or whether it was just known by word of mouth and passed down from generation to generation. It's just a form of indexing, it's a form of cataloging. There are national standards that we use in the United States, and there's also international standards. It's structured information and allows people to identify, locate, and basically retrieve resources. So when you're searching around CollectiveAccess, what we use, ConnecticutCollections, it basically is that search box that you use, that feature, right? And it's all built in to the backbones of CollectiveAccess. The people who work with library metadata or, even just museum metadata or historical society metadata from at a digital level, they're catalogers. So in libraries, they're librarians. And then librarians are also catalogers. So everybody's a cataloger, basically. And they support research by like creating catalogers. Basically what you do is when you're cataloging information in your collections, you're creating and storing and fixing and maintaining data that describes all of your resources in your collections. It's a form of like classification. And again, like I said, indexing. So you think about a book and an index, that's a form of metadata. It's everywhere. Metadata is everywhere. I mean, as you know, in social media, if any of you are familiar, everybody's always tagging things and it's going into the cloud and there's web crawlers. I mean, metadata is everywhere. It's any information about an object at any level of any collection is metadata. So it starts in a very simple form with an object, and then it can be entities within objects, right? So I don't know if that makes sense, but does that make sense to you, Diane? Are you following? Oh, you're muted.
Only because I know what you're talking about.
Okay.
I'm actually pulling up a slide. I'm hijacking myself and pulling up a slide that I put up the other day for a class I talked to at Central.
I think a lot of people sometimes don't understand that metadata, it's pretty basic, right? It could be a single item, or it could be a collection of items, or an entire collection of items, or an entire record keeping system, right? So it starts at the most basic level and builds, and all of these little pieces of information build to bigger pieces of information, and separately and together, they're all metadata. Are you pulling it up now or?
No? Yeah, okay. No, keep talking, go ahead. So I was just typing in the chat on the wrong keyboard as I'm looking at two computers. It's data about data.
Yes, so basically it's just layered, and that's pretty much it. So basic features are like content, right? So what the object contains or is about, which we deal with all the time, right? That's important. Context, the who, what, where, when, why, and how about the object. And then structure relates to basically like how data is presented, how metadata is presented, like MARC, EAD, like finding aids. That's kind of a way of structuring metadata. Is that you, Diane?
Yeah, that's me. This is your flat data in an Excel file just in a grid format versus a relational database as chunks of data that relate to other chunks of data.
So that's a great chart, actually. So you'll see like, this is like, obviously, you know, the flat file, the Excel file Diane just showed, and then the relational database. There's like several different types of relational data between tables. You have like a one-to-one, which is, I don't know if you have that chart again, Diane, which you pretty much don't really use that often, like a one-to-one. One-to-many is kind of what's most common. So like, the best example someone taught me when I was learning databases is if like you have a country and there's like a capital of that country, right? That would be a one-to-one, because there's only one capital of, you know, a country or state, right? But one-to-many is like many cities within one country or one state. So that's a good way of describing data and how it's related to one another. Does anybody have any questions so far? I don't know if any of this is anybody?
It's kind of like when you're looking at this Excel file, you're going to have like one line is only related to all these other lines, and it'll say, this is related to the home FMHC main storage, related to this, related to this. In reality, all of this stuff is related to FMHC, but that's not how this shows up in like an Excel file. It only will explain it for that one row of information. When you change it over to the XML or to the relational database, this will be like your FMHC building, this will be your FMHC building. This will be some of your collections. So they all relate back to this one thing.
Correct. Also, that's like why like acquisition numbers are really important, or any sort of item numbers are really important, because that's the data that carries over the other data, right? It's all related to that one item, which makes it specific, but it can be brought over to many different like subjects, right? So if you're searching, like Diane does a search for bowl all the time, right? That's related. If you come up with all these different, you're the bowl person, right, Diane? Bowling. Yeah. It's related to many different objects, right? But they're all identified by their unique identifier, which is their acquisition number. So accession number, I mean. So that's kind of the basics, I think. I feel like metadata sounds scarier than it is. It's just everywhere. And it's the greatest thing for anybody that's using a collections management system is that it's built into it. So it's not, the more descriptive you are with entering in your items and objects and artifacts and whatnot, the better your search results are going to be. Is that a good explanation? You're muted again.
I'm just going to keep myself unmuted.
Okay.
Always add more information about your records as you go in, because you never know where something is going to make something more accessible. One of my examples is my intern right now, my volunteer, is kind of redoing, you guys may have heard this already, is redoing some of our postcard and photographs that were up on, that are in our database, but were also up on Connecticut Digital Archive. We did it years ago, and whenever they were putting descriptions in, they were doing it in the most basic level, like really basic. They basically said postcard, photograph, people on beach. What beach? Where? How many people? What are they doing? What can you see? And it's actually a photograph of 3 women in a boat in the water. You're looking at Long Island Sound from one of the beaches in Fairfield. All of this is really useful information, and all of it's information that people might want to search. But just having that thing saying people at beach, you're not going to find the boat. You're not going to find Long Island Sound. You're not going to find Jennings Beach in Fairfield. There's a lot of that stuff. So it's a matter of, in order to get the metadata to work for you, it's entering all of it in, to making sure you have all those little bits of data about that main thing. So make it more findable for everybody.
I feel like that's a very good example of my very dry explanation of metadata.
I've been doing this for a while.
Do any of you have any questions about databases in general, or like how it relates to life, because I can go on forever about
How it relates to life. I like it.
No, I'm just kidding. But no, do you have any questions about what's the last two sessions? And then we can get a little bit into normalizing, talk about normalizing and best practices for just entering information into Connecticut collections, because Diane and I have talked about that over and over again. I know all of you aren't just, some of you are like, you know, one person shows, but a lot of you have people that work for you or volunteer or part-time, right? And
volunteers and interns. Yeah.
So there's some best practices out there. Anybody, no questions?
Yeah. Dana, I wonder, I like the idea of best practices and standards. That would be great.
Okay. How about, Dan, do you want to start this off, or do you want me to start it off, or?
We can both chip in on it.
Okay.
Mainly and I kind of talked about this, I think, a little bit, maybe the first one. I have a couple of the recorded meetings and Zooms and things that we talk about it. Because that's one of the bigger messages that I like to get across to everybody is be consistent. That's like the first rule. And the way to become consistent is to kind of set out a mapping of how you're going to do things, write everything down. So you have something that you, when you're introducing new volunteer, you don't have to just sit there and try to remember how to do it. You can hand them like a piece of paper or a guide to how you do things in like particular things. And it doesn't sound like it makes that much difference. Even entering titles, and this can change by group, by institution, by museum. It's whatever is going to work best for you guys. Previously, my predecessor at my last job, her manual, it was both a manual for how to use the system and for how to enter data into the system. She was so detailed. It was amazing, but I could sit there and pick it up. If I ever had a question of like, how are we entering this again? I could pick that book up and look at it. And I knew that what I was entering was going to be the same as everything else. Very important especially if you're starting with a clean database, but honestly important all the way through as you're going through to make sure that things are all findable and that they're easy to look through and read and interpret and that kind of thing. Even down to entering titles. Her way of doing it, which I've continued to follow, is we did the names of the things, not necessarily just what the thing was. And I know a lot of institutions will do like portrait, photograph, and like just do that for their collections. And if that's the way your collections have always been and that works for you guys, that's awesome. Built off of a long ago project at the last place, we would name things by kind of what was going on. So for that like beach photograph, we would say people sailing or women sailing at Jennings Beach, something like that. If we had another version of it, we would say two women sailing at Jennings Beach, just to make it a little bit different. All the letters and the words would be capitalized, with the exception of like and the and stuff like that. But that was in the criteria. So it always looked very uniform, which is really useful if you're looking down a report or a list. Makes it easier to read, honestly. Oh, excellent question, Elise. And this is kind of is like what I was talking about. So building on that, are there standard categories terminology that should be used in the Connecticut Collections database so that searches can be more or less uniform between the institution's collections? Yes, there's something like that kind of built in, but also do come to any of the other sessions or watch any of the other sessions because we'll kind of talk about best practices with things. And that's kind of what like some people using photograph or print or something for their thing. A lot of people are still using nomenclature, which is a standard set of descriptive terms for the title of an object. Some places do not use that. I'm not sure what the status of that is now. I know it's still a very strongly used thing, but I know my old museum was getting away from that because they didn't feel that the people would search under those terms because it wasn't very like intuitive to people looking for things. That aspect of it's kind of I don't want to say gone out the window a little bit, but because of keyword searching and broad searching that this system does and the portal does, it will pick up a lot of those terms. So if I'm entering, I can't think of a good one, bucket, comma, water. Like, I wouldn't think to search for bucket, comma, water, but if I'm searching for water bucket, the keyword search will probably pick that up. So if you've gone to using nomenclature for things and it's working and everything's keeping consistent, go ahead and keep doing it. However it works best for you guys. Like title especially is like an internal decision. For the other terms and terminology, there is a subjects field in the objects. Actually, it's in all of it. It's in the collections, it's in objects. Those are links to standard terminology thesauri, like Library of Congress. So entering those terms in will really help to keep things uniform between institutions. Because when you're searching for water buckets, it'll tell you what the closest term is to that. So when you click on that, everybody, you'll have that same term. The Library of Congress and all the other thesauri can be a little confusing because there's so many of them. It's very much a question of which ones do I use for what. We're definitely going to be doing a either an office hours or webinar or training or something on that. I may switch out some of the future sessions. I have to look at what I have planned, but we may switch that out at some point. The other thing to think about is how you're treating different types of information like people, and even spelling and abbreviations and things like that.
Yeah,
and,
so
I was gonna say, feel free to jump in on this anytime you would like.
Yeah, Diane and I talked about, like, and I think we've talked about it a bit before on office hours, and it's a really great example. Is anybody who's sorted a collection, someone should get something from Mr. and Mrs. or of Mr. and Mrs., right? Or a letter. And the idea is to, like, not ever put them together, right? It's because you're not going to always find both names, right? You're going to just, it's more important to separate them on lines, which isn't that something you always do as a best practice at your Fairfield, Diane?
Always split people, and this is a previous, from my previous museum. Yeah. Say, Mr. and Mrs. Smith donate something, awesome. And you put Mr. and Mrs. Smith in the credit line, gift of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. This is fantastic. Mr. and Mrs. Smith have an ugly, hideous divorce. They split. Neither one of them want to talk to each other again. Mrs. Smith decides to donate half of Mr. Smith's personal belongings that he's left behind, that she has full right and control to do so over. So you're not going to treat them as one person anymore. You're not going to treat them as an entity linked to your record as Mr. and Mrs. Smith. You're going to treat her as Mrs. Smith. She donated the material. You're actually going to give her her name. She actually went back to Johnson. So Mary Smith is now Mary Johnson. She donated things owned by Mr. Smith. You want to be able to kind of keep those separate. Credit line is perfectly fine to keep them together. And I run into all the time, especially any of your institutions that have honestly been around since the 60s, because women's names go through a variety of changes. Way back in the day, it was always Mr. John Smith, Mr. and Mrs. John Smith, Mrs. John Smith. She didn't actually have her own name. She was just always Mrs. his name. It kind of actually weirdly goes away for a little while, at least in my experience with my museums, goes away for a little bit, and she becomes her own person. She becomes Mrs. Mary Smith for a while. And then all of a sudden, somewhere in, like, honestly, in the 60s, I don't even know that it's the 50s, probably a little bit, definitely in the 60s, it goes back a lot to Mrs. John Smith. It's really funny. And I don't know if everybody else has all that too, but it's good to always be able to connect that back to the right person. I also have, I know I've used this example before. I've got a bunch of things from Frederick Lack at Fairfields, Mr. and Mrs. Frederick Lack. Sure, great. So I've had I split them into two. The old system had them as one name, so it kind of migrated that way. He got married twice. His first wife passed away. He got married again. But the way the records were written, you could never tell which wife it was because it always just said Mr. and Mrs. Lack. It gets even better. I don't remember if his second wife passed away or what, but after a while it became Frederick Lack and daughter. Daughter didn't have a name, just daughter is the only way she's known by. It would make that really useful to know who she was in the records. I've since figured that out and it's fine. But yeah, you want to actually search by that person and be able to track that individual person. So the credit line still reads, because that's the way it was written down and that was their wish, like in the accessions register, is written down gift of Frederick Lack and daughter. But as an entity, I have her related as the donor. So we can figure out which are which. That's always a good rule of thumb. And I put in the chat an example of like abbreviations and spellings. And that's where consistency kind of comes in. Long town names, long places like that. I never use abbreviations. The only time I use abbreviations is like federally approved abbreviations, like state abbreviations. So using CT for Connecticut, MA for Mass, any of that I think is fine, especially in addresses, obviously. But even in addresses, spell out street, spell out road, spell out circle, any of those. In the chat, I put a variation of Hartford. So if you always spell out Hartford, that's fine. I might abbreviate it by just HFD. Somebody else might put in HRTF, whatever. Yes, I would always put like the full spelling in the database rather than the abbreviation. Just because so many, if we took a poll right now, I wish I knew how to do polls quickly, I would totally do it, of how to spell something or how you would abbreviate something. I very highly doubt we'd all get the same thing, or we'd get one of the same thing.
So like, and also too, like when you have this in CollectiveAccess, if you were ever to export this as a database, the idea, best practices for creating any sort of file, like a flat file, just for you know, for your own purpose, right? If you want to have one, to save it, because it is literally the most basic form, like a CSV file is the most basic form of data organization. It's really good to spell things out, in my opinion. Like, you know, like Diane says, like some people don't want to spell street or boulevard or road, but we don't know down the line, you know, like 50 years from now, people would even be using those same abbreviations. So, and also you come across problems when cities, I mean, I don't think that's really happened lately, but cities change. That happens like all in the 1700s in Connecticut, especially. So I think it's a good rule of thumb to always, even a lot of people used to abbreviate names, which happened a lot during, I studied Revolutionary War, and that happened all the time in the Revolutionary War. So I think it's always a best practice to really spell things out.
Definitely in like Revolutionary War and stuff too. Yeah, there's unlimited, especially because I previously was in Hartford where there was a lot of weird abbreviations. Now I'm in Fairfield where there's also, I've seen FLD, FFLD, FR, I've seen an FR one that's really weird. So if we're going on to search the system, you know, the keyword search will only get you so far. It still needs to be that whole word that you're searching on. There's, you know, if you search for CONN, in theory, you'll get Connecticut, because the search is set up so it'll search on the beginning of the term and weird things afterwards. If you just search for CT, you may not get it, or you may not get all of what you want. It really depends on the thing. I'm trying to think of some good like terminology abbreviations, and I can't really think of anybody. The town names are the ones I usually think of. So you guys are supposed to be so often,
you just don't realize it. You know what I mean? I mean, I just know because I like clean a lot of data sets, and I'm always like, oh, now I got to change this entire column to a full word, right? So it's a good best practice, you know, because you can always abbreviate in the, you know, eventually. But if you have, it's better. I think it's always better to have
just
more
don't abbreviate.
Don't abbreviate. It's always better to have more information than not enough, right? Like, And if you're teaching like an intern, you know, just say, I want everything spelled out, no abbreviations. There's no real deviation from the norm, right? So you're just like, I would rather we be as detailed as possible, like spell everything out, spell it all out.
Yeah. Jody, you have a question?
Oh, hey, yeah. I was going to say also, this also goes for names, not so much the abbreviation point, but when you were talking about kind of being consistent, I'm finding in one of our databases that some go last name first and others are first name last. And it gets really confusing, especially if there's no comma. I was like, okay, is that a first name? Is that a last name? Especially with, you know, those older names where a first name could be a last name and vice versa. So we've been really consistent in going through and making it, we're going by last name first, last name, comma, first name, just to for that consistency, because that seems the way the majority of it is, but not all of it. So it's just consistency. So I just thought I'd throw that out there too.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And that's something to like write down and track in your notes about your cataloging guide.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's something to put down so you know that everybody's doing it. The system can handle anything, and it could also, in theory, display it however you want to. For the most part, it'll use the display name that you have, and you can change that to different things. So if you looked at the, actually I have this open. I don't remember which window I had it open in. Oh, this is my rest of my scary PowerPoint. Hold on, I'm gonna put it on this while I change it. These are the scary things I find in the collection. Let me go to Sandbox. Please hold. So if you're going to entities and you're putting in names of people, there are separate fields, and you'll see there's separate fields for the forename, the middle name, the surname, because it treats each little bit of data as an individual little bit of data. It's not reading like the whole thing. If you're, side note, if you're doing a migration in something, it'll actually put the full name in like display name, and it parses it out itself based on like a standard thing. If you did last name, first name, it would totally read that if you told it to. But it splits it out into these individual fields. So it lets you go through and like sort and search only by surname and stuff like that. So if you decided to, you can always in your display name change that and put like Banks Clifford S. And that's going to be the way he displays. But you'll still be able to pull out that forename, that surname, and look at like that. So see, his name is now displayed as that. So if that's what you would prefer for your system, totally works. You can also alphabetize on the display name. So if you want to get that full last name thing in there as your main alphabetization, you can do it also based on the surname. But the good thing is the system is very forgiving about stuff like that. It can you also put in alter names for people too, which is really handy. So you do still want to have your consistency, but it helps you change it around if you want, if that makes sense. Actually, Dana, did you want to, or could you talk a little bit about like searching and using abbreviations and last names and how things search, just generally like how stuff searches for terminology and like using quotes around things. And I don't know if you want to do Boolean searches or not, but
it's a little aggressive, but honestly, I always find, you know, shortcuts to searching are super helpful. I think it's really good to start basic, and then if you're not finding what you're looking for, using quotes and I don't know, it depends on the search engine, right? I mean, always, but like I think CollectiveAccess is pretty good. And if anything, you get more than you need to begin with, and then you could always just filter the search or in like do more advanced searches. I think best practices for me, if I'm looking for let's say I'm looking for like a specific person, right, in history, or just to see if anybody even exists that I'm looking for. Obviously, using quotes around a last name is helpful. But you can also search by name. Now that we wait until you see the new improved collective access, like Connecticut Collections, because there's a lot more filtering available to you, which I think is really much more easier to use within the search itself. I guess my most basic search terms usually do involve a quotation. You can use and, right? A little bit more difficult. I don't know, Diane, how do you normally, what's your best practice for searching? I mean, that's kind of
the same thing. I start pretty broad, and then
Mhm.
depending on what I get, I'll change my search depending on my results. I am a big fan of using quotes around things to make it a phrase. It depends again on what I'm searching for. If I am searching for a Revolutionary War, I always put quotes Revolutionary War.
right.
Assuming I'm not looking for an actual subject heading.
Hopefully, but then you have to think about American Revolution, right? Some people will word it that way. Yeah, there's then there's a lot of different Revolutionary War. I have a lot of problems. So War for Independence, like there's always people term it depending on the collection, and depending on the title of the actual piece, it can be many things. So I think that's how searches begin, is somewhere simple. And then if you don't find anything, you change the wording around a little bit to see if you can find it.
And that's why I use the Library of Congress subject headings, which are wacky. But once you get used to them and into them a little bit, they'll make more sense. But that'll end up with one term for everything. So you can always go there. I don't know when this banknote, I am in the sandbox. Yeah, I'm in the sandbox. And like I said, we're going to do a whole series, a whole webinar on something about this, either office hours. Most people are familiar with Library of Congress subject headings from like you're back in grade school going to the library and having the librarian tell you, this book is about dogs, and you see the word dogs on that one page at the beginning of the thing. So that's always going to be the term that you want. And I don't remember if it finds it this way or not, but like American Revolution, World War II are not in there as those words. Oh, see, this is nice that it comes right up with American Revolution Bicentennial 1976. So with the semi-quincentennial coming up, that will be something you might want to use a lot. But you don't see just plain American Revolution. What it is, like the actual subject heading for it is United States History Revolution 1775 to 1783. No one's necessarily going to search for that. But sometimes it'll come up in the same thing. But when you go down and look at a list of headings, if you're filtering, you will see it there. Do I have the new? No, I don't have Spotify.
I was excited. I thought you had like
sorry. Oh, there it is.
Like a playlist for the new one or something,
Playlist for the new thing. Sneak peek at the new public portal.
So awesome.
So when you go in, it looks a little bit different. We'll get into it and probably do a little test drive for everybody at some point. Anyway, let's see. Actually, I wonder if we have anything of the sort. The American Revolution. Make this a little bit bigger. Oh, actually, I need to go to full results. So after you do a search on something, you'll be able to filter over here on things like subjects. And this will work. United States History Revolution, these dates. So even if you're like, oh, I want an American Revolution. Oh, this must be American Revolution. You can click that and it will get you the thing. Even for stuff like Civil War. Civil War is also a weird heading. And I forget exactly what it is. I used to know. But it's like War of Rebellion. I don't know. There's a couple different names for it. So also figure if you're searching in the South, you may have people going, oh yeah, the War of the Rebellion, and we're like, no, the Civil War. Plus there's civil wars all over the world. So just searching for Civil War is not necessarily going to give you the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. That's kind of the importance of using subject headings like that when you can, or using standard terminology. There's stuff that you probably have in your own institution that you're stronger in than others, that you're still going to say American Revolution, but just make sure that everyone's always using American Revolution, spelling things out, capitalizing like the same way. So you're going to be able to find it a bit easier. It's all just kind of the information that you put in is what people are going to be searching on. Way back in the day, we did the kind of pre-project to Connecticut Digital Archive. This is back in like 2001. They had full meetings with all the catalogers in this project between started as 5 institutions. I think there ended up being, there was definitely a few more after that. They would have like apparently very heated debates between the catalogers over terminology, just to make sure that everybody was consistent, using terms like automobile versus car, dirt streets versus dirt roads, blue collar workers. That was a huge debate, apparently. I never went to any of those meetings, which I'm kind of happy about because, again, apparently they were quite contentious. And it was usually trained librarians that were doing it. So folks who were very familiar with subject headings and terminology and all that, figuring out what was what. And yeah, the blue collar worker one, from what I remember when our cataloger came back, was like a huge thing. I don't remember what they ended up deciding on. But one of the main things that we had talked about too is making a very broad headings and broad terminology for things. Because when you look at some of the Library of Congress subject headings and other subject things, they're very detailed and very long and a lot of information. What if we're just looking for automobiles? You don't have to say automobiles, Connecticut, roads, mechanical, whatever weird long thing that might appear. You just want to use like automobiles and people will find it. If you think that no one's going to search on automobiles, which is very possible, use cars too. Use both. Use car in your description, but then put automobile in a subject heading. Kind of cover your bases. That's another thing I'm telling my volunteer all the time. She's like, well, should I put trees in as a subject heading? Well, no, it's not really about trees. And you already said trees in your description. So trees will turn up. For the most part, people are just going to do a quick search. It's going to be rare that people are going to really go in for the really detailed things. If you have detailed information, go ahead and add it. I know I've told this story before, so at least one of you is bound to have heard it. In those early days of cataloging the photographs, I was like beginning doing it, and my curator would like kind of review what I put. And she's like, oh, well, doesn't he have elm trees labeled in that pencil drawing? And I'm like, well, yeah, do I need to put that in? She's like, yes, make sure you put in elm trees. I'm like, okay, sure. I don't know that anyone's going to be looking for that, but whatever. Swear to God, like within 2 weeks, she had a researcher call up and say that he was looking into the history of elm trees in Connecticut. And I was like, well, he can search for that now because she made me put it in there. So the more detail you can put, the better, as long as it's stuff like in photographs, especially that you can see, or things that are relevant in your objects. Once you get into collections, you can still put subjects and things in there. That's a little bit harder because of the many topics and things that are in manuscript and archival collections. All you can do is do those finding aids and give the broad overview of stuff. And then it's going to be up to the people themselves to come in and do the research and look for the stuff. If you've got papers on, like Fairfield's got papers related to Caleb Brewster, who suddenly became super popular when the TV show Turn came out. Everybody and their brother was looking for information on him. Like we had already known that he was an interesting person in Fairfield, so his subject heading got in there like a decent amount with the papers and the manuscripts. But it's up to, we're not going to go through and label every single piece of paper. We're just going to label the collection as having stuff related to him. and then it comes out to the people coming to do the research on it. And we can just kind of point them in a direction with that, as opposed to like full out looking at spurs that were given to him as a presentation in something. I don't even know that he's in there. I'm not going to share my screen because I don't know that he's in there in the sandbox. So does anyone have questions on this? Oh, and one of the things, the main thing, like kind of getting back to the point of the like Excel files versus relational databases, you go in and you search for Caleb Brewster, you're going to find stuff that all relates to him. We're going to relate him to the objects. So you'll find him, but then you'll find that we have these presentation spurs. You'll find that we have these object collections, and it all relate to different chunks of data. So the object data will relate to him. The manuscript data will relate to him. Maybe we might have something in a diary about the spurs, like those will relate to each other. So it saves you a lot of different searches. And rather than having to go through the Excel, something like that, and find like, oh, here's a line, here's a line, here's a line, I wonder how these all relate. It will do the work for you too, which is, you guys already all know this, otherwise you wouldn't be here. I mean, Past Perfect, frankly, does the same thing. Any of those styles of databases will do it. But you just want to make sure that that's where you want to make sure that your consistency is. Like if I have Caleb Brewster and somebody else back in the day has put C Brewster Spurs in as the object, you may not necessarily find it. So that's something down the line that you can change and put in Caleb Brewster or link him somehow. So all that stuff does relate. The more detail of those related items that you can add, the better. Just something else just came across my head when I said that, and it went right back out again.
I would agree, though, while you're looking for that thought, like anything you can do as far as the drop downs that are provided to, like, you know, it'll just make your collection or your objects more accessible, right? The more information you can provide, the better your chances of returning a search on it will be, and it'll be easier for you too. Especially dates. Dates are really important. If all else fails, you always have dates. So if you search 1775 through 1783, you're probably you might hit some items that are related to the war, right? Back to that example we used earlier. But yeah, I think that, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you probably use Ancestry too. And if you look at the way you search there, I've been using it for years and years and years. They're always changing, like those lookup tables, right? Because there's always more information, or it could be done better, right? So and people are adding to the collections like other ways to describe them, right? That's why it's so popular. That's why, you know, back in the day there was no paywall. It's paywall now because it's useful, right? So that's kind of the idea, is the more information you provide, the better the index you provide, the better the metadata you provide, the better your results will be, the searches will provide, right? So we're only good as the Connecticut Collections in general is only as good as the individual information you're all entering into it. So
and for yourself and for public access. So even just for your own in-house use.
Exactly. And I do like the LOSC like has like their terminology, Library of Congress and Getty, because it does sometimes, even when you're not completely sure, you can like just do a quick search and just see if it pertains to your object, and you're like, that's a great way to describe it in a way that someone's going to find it, and then they're going to get to see my description as well, right? So it's a really nice way to do things. It's very basic, like a lot of them are very generalized, but it gets people in the right place, right? So that's the idea.
This is where we like general.
Yes.
So yeah, streets, dirt streets, firefighters. Oh my gosh, if you look under firefighters, there's 18 million different subcategories. And I remember having to look some of those up, and I'm like, oh, actually, no, we just want firefighting and firefighters. We don't need all of these sub ones. We just want to find the fire and go from there. So does anyone have any questions at this point, either related to this, related to previous general work cataloging questions?
I have I guess, somewhat philosophical question. So if you're starting cataloging from scratch with a collection, do you think it's better to have it take longer and really detail everything, or to do a sort of pass through with less detail to get everything cataloged faster, and then kind of go back to the beginning and add more details to fill it in?
That is an excellent question. Basically depends on what your immediate goals are. Are you looking, do you just want kind of like a basic access inventory to be like, okay, I want to know how many bowls we have. I want to know how many swords we have. Maybe you just want to do that first pass through. Depends on how much knowledge like you and the staff have. Like I'm pretty good on needlework and I'm okay on costumes. So I might tend to put a little bit more detail. I am nowhere near have the knowledge as like a costume consultant does. So, maybe sometime down the road, you either get a volunteer or intern or something has knowledge about a specific thing that they can fill in holes later on. First, saving you from like, hours of research over this one thing of how to describe the splat black of the chair. It depends on that. If you can do stuff off the top of your head, go ahead and add it in. If it's stuff that would take you research, maybe not. If you have 10,000 items in your collection and you really want to just get them all into the system, yeah, skeleton records are great. If you have 100 objects in your collection, you probably have time to be a little bit more detailed. Skeleton records are more than fine to start off with, and you can fill them in as you go. You might be able to fill them in as you get exhibitions and things ready and find out more detail. Just make sure you include what your main fields are that you want to put in those records. Obviously, you're going to have some kind of identifier, usually an accession number. Always have a title, description, even if it's really, really basic. If you have a dress, make sure you put in that it's a sleeveless dress. Make sure you put in that it's orange. Those are pretty basic things that most people know. You may not know that it's a sheath dress, that it has a center back zipper and has a 1.5 inch hem. You may not know that, but it's an orange sleeveless dress. That'll help you out in the long run to even be able to go into the collection and find it. Okay, title, number, title, description. Any of the donors is really good to get in there. Get those donors in there. Owners, if you have it, but at least donors, because that helps you pull stuff together. Mrs. Mary Smith comes in with that huge collection of stuff. You want to be able to see everything that she gave you. And once you've got Mary Smith in there that first time, every time you go into a record with something related to her, you just have to start typing Mary Smith and she appears. You don't have to do that whole first data entry, which is great. Was there one other field that I usually have?
I feel like dates are important if you have them, right?
You can even do very broad.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And doing broad is totally fine.
It depends on so you're talking about a collection that you have or just like sort of just like a ambiguous question or
Yeah, no, it's the collection at the museum I work at.
So yeah, I mean, like, is any of it digital? Is it in a database at all or no?
I have created a broad inventory in Excel.
Oh, great. I mean, if you're using interns or anything along those lines and you trust, I know it's hard to like let go of that, right? And like trust somebody to do it properly, but you could even just maybe parse a few of the fields that you'd want them to enter, right? So that you know exactly what they're entering, and then they could highlight them even, and you or somebody who's more knowledgeable can go back and actually create a better record, right? As long as you know what you want your collection to look like if people or like your objects to look like when people find them online, right? Or when you're looking for them, like Diane's saying.
Yeah, and even when you're starting out like that, just as long as you can find them and they're useful to you, because you may not be ready to put them online at that point yet. This is my slide catalog cribbed from the other day. Session number, title, basic description, like Dana said, date. I always used to even do, it's kind of misleading, but I would do even 50-year broad dates. I would even do century broad dates. If I literally had no idea, and this is where I needed my expert, I would put, well, I know it's in the 1900s sometimes, so it's 20th century, and I would just put 20th century, which sounds really broad, but honestly, if someone calls up and is like, I'm looking for an 18th century sword, that stuff is out. That doesn't have to be included. This was the other part that was really important, is the location. like where is it currently stored in the museum? That's especially if you're doing kind of an inventory style thing. Did I put it on this one? One tool that I use a decent amount is in the records, is down in, this is in an object record, but the other modules have them as well, is under the admin info, is the record status. Is it completed? Is the editing complete? Is it editing in progress? Is it new? Review in progress? I didn't start using that at first. I do use it now, especially when I've got my volunteer who I have her mark it off. So as you're going in, especially if you're just putting in those really skeletal information bits, I always put it as like editing in progress. If you're like fully finished your record, it's got all the information you totally know, then you can check it off as something like review in progress or complete. That'll help you kind of parse out your own information too. So it kind of is something, it's a really good question to ask for yourselves, and like, what are you looking to do? The other way I used to do it too was I had different levels based on, I forget what they were, I should write them down somewhere. Like the skeletal record was basically, I just knew that it existed. And I'm just saying that I have this flashlight. It's a flashlight. It's here. It lives on that shelf. Like that would be like a really basically, I know nothing else but that. That would be like a, I think I call it like a registrar level record of like, that's all I knew. Then I would put in, the next level would be like, I've pulled all the information I can out of its folder, out of its object file, or out of any of the like the accession record data, anything like that, without adding anything super fancy to it. Then there was some level in between, but then there was definitely like a curatorial level of like the curator has come in and say, this is a blue titanium mag light with, you know, circa 1985 with a push button, whatever, and doing a much more descriptive level. So I would have that as like that was like the next to last level. Very few records, honestly, reached what used to be the complete curatorial approved level. And I mean, records are always kind of a living, breathing record anyway, because you can always go in and change them as you go and see, add to them, update them, anything like that. Did that help? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's definitely thinking, definitely, and again, like write it down. So, you know, be like, I would like all records to have these fields. At the very least, a location and a title and an accession number. Actually, at the very least, all the rest of that other stuff, like that skeletal stuff comes in handy. And it doesn't, doing the skeletal doesn't take that much longer than, you know, just putting a number and a title. And trust me, I have lots of numbers and titles in my migrated data from previous. So
I would trust you know, like an intern or like a part-timer, like it's learning, right, to do the basic skeletal whatnot, and then that saves you a lot of that work, right? So you can go back and you can really sort of fine tune it maybe the way you want it. That's just the way I look at things. I like to delegate a lot. That's just me. But some people like have the time and want to have the full control and do it themselves too. So there's really no wrong way. But I think there are many ways. And I think that just, I think being clear in communication, making sure you're not doing the same thing twice and that you're doing it right the first time. I think those are the most important. That's the best methodology, I think, in my opinion, for transposing like database to catalog.
okay.
Could I mention how we're doing ours?
Yeah, of course.
We have a lot of paperwork from 1980 forwards. We have session forms. So in theory, everything's been assigned in a session number. In practice, you find forms where there's a .0, which is all the stuff they didn't feel like actually cataloging individually. So you don't even know how many .0 things there are, but there might be .0, 10 things, and then 20 actual individual items that are cataloged. We have all that paperwork. We've had a person who has put in all of, sorry about that, put in all of the entities and has put in the lots for the accession forms themselves. And then we're farming out the items, the individual item entry to volunteers who are going to, work on it from home or wherever. Our strategy, because in effect, we don't know where anything is. We don't have an inventory saying this is in this exhibit or this is in this box. We're just having them enter the descriptions of the stuff as they appear on the accession forms. And honestly, sometimes it will say dish, and that's what it says. Sometimes it'll have an enormously long description for what turns out to be, a pencil. But whatever the case may be, we're just having the volunteers put it in the way it is. So we've got a title, a description, the item accession number, and it's tied to the accession form, the donor through the accession form. We'll go back later, and in a separate project that's going on, as we're trying to figure out what's where, what do we have? Is it in what's in storage? What's in this display case? What's in which building? Because if the farther back you go in time, the less sure of which building even it's in. So our strategy is just to get all the information that we have into the system, and then go back later, add in the location information when we find the stuff. And in cases where we have some kind of record that says we got rid of that, whatever, we sold it, we threw it out, whatever happened to it, go back and update the information so that you know that what's happened to it or where it is. It's not very pretty, but we don't have the luxury of tracking down each item and figuring it out, because our original guess was we had that number you used before, 10,000 items. We're thinking that was low when you start counting the huge number of photographs and postcards and things. So we got a lot of things. So that's our strategy.
That's awesome, Mike. I love it. I absolutely love it. My counterpart in Minnesota, Hyann, would disagree with me on the fact of agreeing with you and putting in the records that you have without a location, because I know she doesn't put stuff in without a location. The way that I've had with my collection now even is because of the way the records have been kept. It probably does exist. It's probably somewhere. I want to know that it's supposed to exist and be able to track that down. And if I go search for the widget, I want to be like, oh, it's this widget that matches this, this donation. Awesome. What I do also is for location, I have a location called unknown. So if there's something that I'm entering a record and I don't have eyes on it and I don't know where it is, I link it to that unknown, which is different than a missing. That's something you have gone and looked for and can't find. I have it linked to unknown, and then I put a little note in the location notes and just say, usually I'll put location unknown at time of record entry. So that way, 10 years from now, if somebody looks at that record, they'll be like, oh, it says unknown. Oh, they didn't know where this was back in 2023. Huh, that's interesting. And I'll update it, like you're saying, putting in the information afterwards that something's gone. So I love it. I think that's a great strategy to go with. And I've thought a few times that I might just hand off my weird inventory numbers to my intern and just be like, here, just enter these. And eventually it'll all start pulling together. So yeah, having that is good too, as a basis. Yeah, and Denise, if you guys aren't looking at the chat, she said, we are starting from scratch. I'm working on inventory now, and I'll be sure to set it up well so that others can enter skeletal records going forward. Perfect. And the more information when you find the widget, you're like, oh, now I know that it's a blue widget. I didn't know this before. And you don't even have to make it really super exciting at that point. Just adding detail as you go is always helpful. So I like your approach, Mike. That's awesome.
We don't want to put a lot of effort into those items that when you find them, you go, why do we have this? And, why has somebody spent a lot of time describing the broken dinner plate, you know, that
Yep.
you don't want.
Exactly. Or the flagpole that somebody put in the inventory in accessions that was actually just the flagpole in your auditorium that is not actually in the collections. Yeah, stuff like that. Because we all have it. Awesome. Any questions from anybody else? It's a little bit after 11. So if everybody's good, we can end.
I feel like we had a lot of great questions, so thank you. And you know, especially the questions about like the categories and terminology, which I think could make for another interesting office session, or even just maybe a best practices on the on Connecticut Collections in general, which might be helpful.
They're definitely on the list.
Yeah. What?
They're definitely on the list.
Yes, there you go. So,
all right.
But yeah, thank you all very much.
And we will see you next month, hopefully. I don't remember what we're covering, so it'll be a surprise to all of us. Thanks, everybody.